here tonight. This evening is a culmination of a collaboration that has happened over the last few months between the Sargent House Museum and the Cape Ann Museum. Sometime last fall, Amanda Hurd, who's the president of the Sargent House Board, came to the museum and said, I have a proposition for you. I'm wondering if you would be interested in serving as the winter residence for our two Sargent portraits. Now, needless to say, no arms were twisted as a result of this request. We embraced the idea, and since then, since October, the paintings have been hanging upstairs in the third floor gallery, so if you haven't had a chance to see them, I hope you'll make sure, if not tonight, you'll come back to see them. I know there are a number of Sargent House board members in the audience tonight, and I would like to ask them to stand so that we could express our appreciation to them. And I don't usually do this, but since we're having board members standing, I know there are 5 or 6 members of the museum, Cape Ann Museum's board, in the audience, and I hope that you'll all stand and let us acknowledge you as well. So this is my opportunity to plug for a moment membership. As you all know, both of our institutions, the operations of our institutions are supported by membership and by donations. And so if you are not a member of either of our institutions, or one and not the other, I encourage you to think about it. We have information on the table outside about membership for both Sargent House Museum and the Cape Ann Museum, as well as our spring program for all the activities that will be happening here at the museum over the next few months. So, it's been a great treat for us to have the Sargent House works on loan here. A wonderful opportunity for us as a museum to show them, and a wonderful opportunity for our communities to see these works year-round. It's not like the doors close and you're not able to see them. They've been on exhibit year-round, and it's really been, I think, a great thing. It's also been wonderful for us to use this opportunity to bring Sargent lovers together tonight. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Erica Hirshler, Croll Senior Curator of American Paintings at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to present Looking at John Singer Sargent. Erica is no stranger to our institution, nor to the Sargent House. She's an expert, or to John Singer Sargent. She's an expert in American painting from the 19th and 20th centuries, and has published extensively on Sargent, as well as Mary Cassatt, Childe Hassam, Dennis Bunker, William Merritt Chase, and on women artists and women collectors. Her widely acclaimed book, Sargent's Daughters, is available for sale tonight at the museum, and she may be willing to sign a few copies if you like. And after her talk, we'll leave some time for questions. So without any further ado, I hope that you'll welcome Erica Hirshler.
Thank you, Rhonda, so much, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, the first spring night of 2017. I don't know whether we should worry about that or be grateful. Let's be grateful. Anyway, it's a real pleasure for me to be here and to speak to all of you. What I'm going to do tonight is a little bit of a romp through John Singer Sargent's career. Because I like him so much, I really couldn't decide what one little thing I was going to talk about, so I just decided to talk about all of it. So when I first began to study American art, and I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, my favorite painting by Copley was Ypes Sargent on the left, painted about 1760 and now in the collection of the National Gallery of Art. It was my favorite Copley then, and it's still my favorite Copley. Ypes Sargent was about 70 years old when he posed for Copley. He was a prosperous merchant and ship owner who had dropped out of Harvard to enter business in his native Gloucester, as you probably all know. What you might not know is that when Gilbert Stuart saw this portrait by his elder compatriot Copley, Stuart said, "Prick that hand and blood will spurt forth." He was so amazed by Copley's unbelievable realism. But I always found that in this painting, Copley's realism was mixed with something else, really, a revelation maybe of the inner soul of his sitter. It looks so far-seeing to me, something that tells you a little bit about his character and his dreams in a beautifully evocative way. And that characteristic, I think, is also true of the work of his descendant, John Singer Sargent, who you see here on the right in a self-portrait from about 1906 that he made for the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And I was always delighted to, when I finally found out that Ypes and John were related. There is a direct connection between these two Sargents. And as I said, tonight I'm going to give you a cook's tour of John Singer Sargent's work. I've decided to organize it by place, and you'll see how this painter, who was acclaimed internationally, kept returning to his Massachusetts roots. So let's begin not in Massachusetts, but in Florence. And I would remind you that Sargent was born in 1856 in Florence to American parents, who you see here on the right-hand side of the screen and much more beautifully upstairs in the galleries here at Cape Ann. Mr. and Mrs. Sargent had been abroad since 1854 to regain their health and their spirits after the loss of a child. And as my friend Richard Ormond has put it, they forgot to come home. Fitzwilliam Sargent, who you see here at upper right in a portrait made by his son about 1880, was a physician with a distinguished New England lineage. And his ancestor was Winthrop Sargent, the very distinguished brother of Ypes, the Copley sitter. His mother, Mary Newbold Singer, who you see at lower right, was from a prominent Philadelphia merchant family. And they met in Philadelphia when Fitzwilliam was in medical school there and married there in Philadelphia. They moved to Europe, as I said, in the mid-1850s and had 3 surviving children, John the eldest, born in 1856, and as early as 1867, when Sargent was just 11 years old, his mother wrote that Johnny, as she put it, was captivated by landscape. And she said, "He appreciates the beauties of nature and art which are so lavishly displayed in these old lands. He sketches quite nicely and has a remarkably quick and correct eye." I'm showing you a page from a sketchbook that's at Harvard of the Belvedere torso, that great, wonderful classical sculpture, and of the head of the Apollo Belvedere. Sargent was 13 years old when he drew those, and he was 14 when he made the image of the Alps that you see at the lower right. Sargent filled sketchbooks with very accomplished renderings in pencil and watercolor of alpine scenery, classical sculpture, all of which he would return to as subject matter later in his career. His father bragged in an 1870 letter, "My boy John seems to have a strong desire to be an artist by profession," capital A, "a painter. And he shows so much evidence of talent in that direction and takes so much pleasure in cultivating it that we have concluded to gratify him and keep to that plan." So Sargent began his formal training in the early 1870s in Florence at the Florence Academy, where they took a very traditional method of artistic training, and you see that traditional method on the left in a recent photograph of the Florence Academy, where you can see that drawing from images from the classical past, whether they be sculpted or live, is still very much a part of their curriculum. On the right, you see a late watercolor by Sargent from about 1910 of a statue of Perseus after Cellini that shows a model in a very, very similar pose. And I show it to you to point out how that early mastery of figure drawing and of drawing after the antique infused his whole career. Well, Florence had what it had to offer, but soon it became evident that a higher level of instruction was in order. And then we move our scene to Paris. In 1874, Sargent moved to Paris with his family in order to further his artistic education. Paris, of course, was the place to go. Every aspiring artist from multiple countries headed to Paris to further their artistic education. This is Sargent's view of the Luxembourg Garden in Paris, painted in 1879, now in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum. I want to point out that unlike artists who came from the United States and didn't know French and sort of ended up in a kind of expatriate community in Paris, took their lessons and then went home, Sargent was in a different category. He was completely at home in Paris. First of all, his family was there, so he wasn't homesick. And second of all, he was fluent in French, which made a big difference in terms of how well you could integrate into the artistic community. And I would just add that Sargent was also fluent in both German and Italian. His friend Vernon Lee described him as an accentless mongrel. So Sargent took two kinds of lessons in Paris. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, which you see in my sort of crooked slide at the upper left, where he continued his firm training in the academic tradition. He also took independent classes that were offered by the man that you see at lower right, Carolus Duras, who was one of the leading stylish portraitists in Paris. And Sargent studied with both the masters at the École des Beaux-Arts and with Carolus. And he learned a lot. Interestingly, while he was studying in Paris, he took his first ever trip to the United States in 1876. He was 21 years old. He was an American. He'd never been here. He went with his mother. He established his citizenship in the U.S. I'm showing you at the upper right a painting from the MFA's collection by an American artist resident in Paris named Henry Bacon, who specialized in shipboard scenes. And I just like the idea of illustrating the kind of transatlantic crossing that became such a frequent occurrence for Sargent. He went to Philadelphia. He met his family. He went to the great International Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. I'm showing you the catalog on the left-hand side. And then he did some, touristy things, like he went to Niagara Falls. And the drawing that you see at the second one, in the middle one on the right-hand side, that pencil drawing, for a long time had been identified simply as ocean waves. But in fact, it's Niagara Falls. If you look carefully, you can see another bank on the other side of that flowing water. So we know that Sargent was seeing the great sights of the United States. We also know from unbelievably beautiful paintings like this one, called The Derelict, painted in 1876 and in a private collection. If you own it, call me. That Sargent was not only studying traditional art, but also sort of breathing in the most avant-garde art of Paris of the day. This beautifully loose composition with its opalescent colors is very much in keeping with avant-garde French painting of the day by artists like Courbet and Monet. And I use it to introduce to you the idea that Sargent, who you see here at the top of the screen in a very bohemian devil-may-care pose in about 1883, was very much at home in international cosmopolitan circles. The woman you see at lower left was named Henrietta Roybal. She was a Franco-American saloniste, as we call them, a hostess who invited interesting people to her apartment and brought people together. For example, Sargent and Henry James, who you see at bottom center. They befriended one another, I think, at Henrietta Roybal's salon. Sargent was also friendly with a lot of avant-garde artists and musicians, and I'm showing you here at lower right Sargent's portrait of Auguste Rodin, who was a friend for many, many years of his life. And finally, in 1877, the year after he returned to Paris, he embarked on his professional career. This is Fanny Watts, shown at the Paris Salon of 1877, that great international exposition where an artist, it was a juried exposition, and artists strove to earn their artistic reputation at this great international show that received a lot of audience attention, but also was written up in the international press. Fanny Watts was a childhood friend of Sargent's. She was also American, as were many of Sargent's early sitters. Her family, like the Sargents, had expatriated to Europe to economize. That's something you could do in the 19th century. In case you think they were all rich, it was actually much cheaper to live in Europe than it was in the United States. The Watts family met the Sargents in Italy or maybe in southern France in the 1860s, and Fanny and John Sargent remained lifelong friends. Sargent just shows her sort of half-length sitting in a chair, but she seems almost electrified, almost as if she's squirming in that chair, coiled like a spring, very much of the moment, ready to move. And that kind of modern painting caught everybody's attention at the Salon. He immediately announced himself as a painter to be reckoned with. One critic said, and this is important, Sargent has done a better thing than the French do. Those are fighting words, and I hope you will keep them in mind. The next year, Sargent showed his portrait of Carolus Duran, his teacher, looking very much the dapper dandy that Carolus was, in fact, in life. And I think you'll remember the black and white photograph that I showed you. It's very like him indeed. Carefully shown with his long tapering fingers, his walking stick, his Legion of Honor pinned to his lapel. He looks like the quintessential observer of the boulevards, the flaneur who had appeared in the work of Charles Baudelaire and others. Sargent showed this and inscribed the painting to my dear master. It says in French in the upper left-hand corner. If you go to the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, you can see for yourself. But even though it says to my dear master, it really seems to me to be a declaration of independence. And soon after this portrait, Sargent began to get commissions, maybe some portrait commissions that might even once have been given to Carolus himself, like the portrait of Madame Subercaseaux, who you see on the left, a portrait from 1880, the year after the Carolus portrait. Beautiful, stylish, wearing the most up-to-date gown, turning again in her chair as if we've just interrupted her as she's been playing the piano, made incredibly beautiful by that teal blue juxtaposed with the red blossoms. Madame Subercaseaux was the wife of the Chilean ambassador to Paris and a friend of Sargent's. The painting is now in a private collection. But Sargent was very savvy about his exhibition strategy, and he reminded his audience that he was not just a portrait painter, and he alternated the works that he showed at the Salon that were portraits with pictures like the one you see on the right, also in the collection of the Clark, Fumée d'Ambergris, the woman in North Africa incensing her veil, an exotic subject, a genre scene, and an incredible display of Sargent's mastery of the use of white paint. Well, in 1882, he burst onto the Salon stage with this, El Jaleo, from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum now. Very well received. It was, and I quote, the most talked about picture in Paris. It was Carolus, actually, who had infused his students with a love of the Spanish painter Velázquez, who he deeply admired, as did Sargent. And Sargent had gone to Spain in 1879, where he made copies after Velázquez's work and sketches of life in Spain, eventually coming back to Paris and producing this monumental composition in his Paris studio. What's so spectacular to me about it, aside from its liveliness and its unbelievable sort of judicious use of black, white, and gray with just little touches of orange and the shawl of the woman at the far right, in the orange that sits on that empty chair at the left. It's remarkably vivid. There's even a handprint on the wall just below those guitars. But to me, it's both timeless and very modern. And it has a wonderful combination of motion, of dancing, of clapping, and of stillness, a moment captured in time. Well, never content just to do the same thing again, the next year, Sargent showed this, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. Another triumph, a very different kind of painting, always demonstrating, as I said, the range of his talents, but now with a composition that was very much about modern life. 4 little girls, 4 ordinary little girls in the front hall of their Paris apartment. But Sargent turned it into something absolutely extraordinary, a painting of 4 girls that's much, much more than a portrait. It too was inspired by Velázquez, and I just bring Velázquez's Las Meninas from 1656 to your attention on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see how he borrowed that angular division of the canvas. It's a painting in the Velázquez on the right and a red screen in the Sargent on the left. But that sort of odd, shadowy room backed by light with the open doorway in the Velázquez and the mirrored reflection in the back of the Sargent and the disparate arrangement of figures. But as much as Sargent's painting looks to the past, it also looks to the present. And I'm very intrigued with, someday I'm going to find out more about the relationship between Sargent and Degas, whose work you see on the right. His Wellesley family at the upper right, one of his many ballet rehearsals at the center, and a wonderful painting called the Place de la Concorde at the lower right from the Hermitage Museum, all of which share qualities with Sargent's work. Again, the box-like space with an arbitrary arrangement of figures. The way the figures don't really interact with one another at all. And that odd centrifugal space that you see in the Place de la Concorde at lower right and also in the Sargent, where the center of the canvas, the place that usually is the most important part, is absolutely blank. Well, Sargent, by this time, had received sufficient recognition and new commissions to take on a new studio in a fashionable neighborhood in Paris. And you see him here sitting in it. It was on the Boulevard Berthier. And this photograph was probably made around 1883. He not only moved to a fashionable neighborhood and, as you can see, decorated his studio in a fashionable way, but he took on a very fashionable sitter, who you see here on the right. Her name was Virginie Avegno-Gautreau. She was an American woman from New Orleans who had moved to Paris with her mother after her father died fighting for the Confederacy during the Civil War. She eventually married a Parisian banker and became known in Paris society as a professional beauty, a very celebrated, very self-consciously presented belle. Sargent met Madame Gautreau in late 1882 and became completely obsessed with her, finally convincing her to let him paint her portrait. And he worked on it for a very long time. Sargent wasn't the only one who wanted to make a picture or a sculpture of Madame Gautreau. The American painter Edward Simmons, who was then also a student in Paris, described her in his memoirs, and I quote, "She was black as spades and white as milk. Something about her gave you the impression of infinite proportion, infinite grace, and infinite balance. Every artist wanted to show her in marble or in paint." So Sargent's portrait was not a commission. It was something he did because he wanted to do it. And Madame Gautreau was a particularly uncooperative sitter. All three of these sketches, the watercolor and the two pencil drawings, come from the collection of Harvard, and you can see in them how Sargent struggled to find the right pose, working in pencil, working in watercolor. Sargent described her as hopelessly lazy. She never wanted to pose, but he was completely transfixed by her and by her cameo-like profile. This is the finished product in an illustration from 1884 on your right. On your left, you see a letter that Sargent wrote to a friend in Paris, which had a postscript by Madame Gautreau. The letter is now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, part of a big gift of all of a huge collection of Sargent archival material, hundreds of letters and photographs that we're very proud to have. So in the finished product, as you can see on the right, Sargent showed Madame Gautreau as she no doubt wanted to be seen. She looks very sophisticated, perfectly groomed, elegantly dressed, urban and independent, and she loved it. And in this letter, she says, "Sargent has made a masterpiece of my portrait." She didn't love it very much after it appeared at the Salon, where it was savaged by the critics. As one of Sargent's friends reported, it was surrounded by shoals of astonished and gibing women. As one critic put it, of all the ladies in undress, and there are many at any Salon exhibition, of all the ladies in undress, the only one of interest is Sargent's, interesting for its attention to the fine profile reminiscent of Piero della Francesca, interesting for its décolletage and the chains of silver, which are indecent and give the impression that they are about to fall down. Interesting for the powder that makes her skin cadaverous and clownish at the same time. And there were many caricatures of the painting. There were always caricatures of paintings at the Salon. The one that I'm showing you here shows the bodice as if it were a heart, and the caption says, "New model for the Ace of Hearts." Many Parisians pretended to be shocked by this picture. I am completely convinced that there's something else going on here. I think that in the end, the painting became a sort of lightning rod for something else altogether. Sargent really had represented Madame Gautreau as she really wanted to be seen, as a quintessential Parisienne. And I'm showing you on the right a painting by a French artist called La Parisienne from 1883, so the year before Sargent finished Madame X. It's by Charles Giron, and it shows a sort of very sophisticated lady dressed in black. She happens to be wearing an afternoon outfit that's much more covered up than the décolletage that would have been appropriate for evening. But you can see she's standing next to a table, she's got her face in profile, the whole thing. But what was an audience, a French audience in particular, to make of a Parisienne who wasn't French? And I think a premonition of the hostile reception that was accorded to Sargent's portrait comes in 1881, so a couple years earlier, when in a magazine, sort of cynical words were sparked when an American horse won the Grand Prix at Longchamp for the first time. And the writer who was talking about the horse race said, and I quote, "I know, since the victory of Foxhall," that's the horse, "one determined French patriot who can no longer, without a lot of grumbling, say the name America. He finds the Yankees a bit unbecoming. They have painters who carry off our medals like Mr. Sargent. Beautiful women who eclipse ours like Madame Gautreau. And horses that beat our steeds. It's a peaceful war, but they come to hoist their victory colors over our land." Sargent and Madame Gautreau, I think, had very similar aims. They both wanted to be the best, not just in the colony, the American colony in Paris, but in all of Paris. And to a huge extent, they both succeeded. But there was that one obstacle that they could never overcome, which is they could never truly be French, and therefore never truly accepted. Madame Gautreau's mother cried that her daughter had been lost, and while Madame Gautreau did retreat for a time from French society, she recovered enough to have her portrait painted a few years later with the strap down. Sargent, who you see on the right in his studio with the painting, was taken completely off guard, and it took him a while to get back on his feet. As you can see in the painting on the left, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as you most probably all know, he repainted that strap to be up, which is why I was only showing you the black and white before, because now the strap is up. He repainted it. And he kept the portrait with him in his studio until 1915, when Madame Gautreau died and Sargent felt able to sell it to the Metropolitan. And he said, let's not use the lady's name, which is why it is now called Madame X. Well, our story has to shift again. Sargent had already, with Henry James's encouragement, begun to think about moving to England, even before the whole thing happened at the Salon. And he had a few portrait commissions in hand there, among them a number of commissions from the Vickers family. And I'm showing you now the Mrs. Vickers from 1884. Well, he had started this painting, and then, funnily enough, all his French portrait commissions began to dry up in the wake of Madame X. And I showed you a letter that I forgot to tell you what it was, but he does write to a friend and say, I have no commissions, probably due to what he calls the Gautreau disaster. But aside from the Vickers commission, Sargent had few offers in England either, because his portraits, including this one, which was exhibited in London, was considered, and I quote, beastly French. Can't win. And so Sargent made a foray into landscape painting at this time. He renewed his acquaintance with Claude Monet, who you see here at upper right in Sargent's painting of Monet painting at the edge of the wood from 1885 in the collection of the Tate in London. Sargent went to Giverny in 1885 and shows Monet working outdoors in a way that he himself would soon adopt. Sargent sharpened his own landscape technique, joining a group of American and British painters in the English countryside at Broadway in the Cotswolds. And you're seeing his home fields from 1885 at the lower right. I think this painting might be an illustration that goes beautifully with a description of how Sargent painted the landscape by one of his friends. Sargent started a new canvas every morning, Goss wrote, painting for a couple of hours at a time with the utmost concentration. I don't think he'd worked much in the open air before. He was accustomed to emerge, carrying a large easel, to advance a little way into the open, and then suddenly to plant himself down nowhere in particular, behind a barn, opposite a wall, in the middle of a field. The process was like that in the game of musical chairs, where a player has to stop dead wherever he may happen to be. The other painters were all astonished at Sargent's never selecting a point of view, but he explained it in his half-inarticulate way. His object was to acquire the habit of reproducing precisely whatever met his vision, without previous arrangement of detail. The painter's business, he said, not to pick and choose, but to render the effect before him, whatever it may be. So Sargent made landscapes, and he also began to try and reconcile landscape painting, which is usually very fluid and bright, with the kind of figure painting that he had been practicing in Paris. And in the end, he reinvented himself as an English painter with this beautiful composition, Carnation Lily, Lily Rose, from 1885, now in the Tate. He started it in the summer of 1885. He didn't finish it until the following summer of 86. He exhibited it at the Royal Academy in London in 1887, where it was immediately purchased for the nation and given to the Tate. This painting established Sargent's early reputation in England and translated, if you will, his style from a French vocabulary into an English one. And I just bring back the Boyts to make that point for you. Both of these paintings explore the private world that children inhabit, a world in which we as adults seem only to be intruders. But one of them is in that dark palette, showing modern life in the way that Sargent had done in Paris, and the one on the right is now completely transformed into contemporary English taste, which you can see here by my comparison with British art on the right, a painting by William Stott of a girl in a meadow from 1880 at the upper right, and one of those beautiful William Morris tapestries covered with blossoms that you see at lower right. It was very connected to English taste, very balanced between an exploration of Impressionism, a concern for transient light effects at twilight where the lanterns begin to glow and the sun fades. The title was drawn from a popular British song about the innocence of childhood. So you can see that he learned quickly what it took to be an English painter. But he still wasn't getting portrait commissions. So the next year, Sargent and his portrait of the Boyd daughters came to the United States, traveling across the Atlantic by steamship in the fall of 1887. And right as he arrived, there was an article in Harper's New Monthly magazine, I show you 2 pages of it here, written by none other than Henry James, all about this new painter who was coming to the United States. It appeared in the American press a month before Sargent disembarked, and it had engravings, as you can see, of some of Sargent's most famous work. Pretty good pre-publicity, I would say. His early portraits do tend to connect to his life in Paris. On the left, his 1887 portrait painted in Boston of Mrs. Edward Darley Boyd, who he knew perfectly well in Paris. She was one of the first commissions that he received in Boston, and you see her there looking very jovial in her rented Mount Vernon Street townhouse. He stayed with them on Mount Vernon Street and painted not only Mrs. Boyd, but Edward Boyd's cousin, Louise Pomeroy Inches, who you see on the right. I think you can see this is all connected, all family. But what Sargent did was bring to these Boston women a new cosmopolitan sophistication. Another person who was quick to line up was Isabella Stewart Gardner. Here she is in the great 1888 portrait from the Gardner Museum. Well, Mrs. Gardner had already met Sargent. She went to London specifically to see Madame X. And I think she clearly wanted something similarly dramatic. In fact, Henry James described this painting as a Byzantine icon with a halo. Mrs. Gardner said that she rejected at least 8 renderings of the face before she was satisfied with it. And I just tell you that to point out the frustrations of being a portraitist. This painting also inspired gossip and legend. Somebody jokingly titled it "Woman, an Enigma." And other people believed that the sensuous display of décolletage and the way her pearls were wrapped around her waist was just a little bit too much for Boston. Jack Gardner, Isabella's husband, seems to have agreed. He asked his wife not to show the portrait publicly again during his lifetime, and it stayed in the private rooms of Fenway Court. He's also reputed to have said, "It looks like hell, but it looks like you." Sargent sailed back to London flush with his American triumph, and his studio on Tite Street, which you see here, an exterior on the left, the building is still there, and two 1920s photographs of the interior of it on the right. His studio on Tite Street, which was in the Chelsea district of London, a very artistic neighborhood. Whistler had, in fact, owned one of these studios and still lived nearby. Oscar Wilde lived across the street. Sargent's mother and sister lived around the corner. This became portrait central for Sargent as soon as he received his first English success with Lady Agnew of 1892, now in the National Gallery of Scotland. His portrait of Lady Agnew, her haunting, beguiling beauty, confirmed his reputation as a portraitist in Britain. And why? What did he do? He looked back to the British portrait tradition. Here is Lady Agnew compared now with a Reynolds portrait at upper right from 1771 and a Raeburn portrait at lower right from 1795. Sargent used English history for his inspiration, adopting that sort of poetic, half-length portrait of women by Reynolds and his contemporaries, and thus positioning both his sitter and also himself as the successor to a very long, beloved history of English national tradition. After Lady Agnew, all of London was at Sargent's feet, and he got lots of commissions. He was able to bring that sense of both modernity and history to his portraits of men as well. This is his Earl of Dalhousie on the left from 1900, still in the family's collection. And I think you'll agree that he was channeling Van Dyck that day. This is Van Dyck's Lords John and Bernard Stewart on the right from 1638 in the National Gallery. And portraits like the Earl of Dalhousie would hang in houses that had works by Van Dyck and Reynolds in them. So it was only fitting that Sargent made new portraits that would fit into that tradition. I hope you see how modern the Earl looks as well. Look at his face. He's been wearing a hat outside, and you can see that he's sunburned, but not where he was wearing his hat. Do you see that stripe across right under his hairline? So again, these old master references combined with a very modern take. And Sargent was in constant demand from the most upper crust British aristocrats, like Lord Ribblesdale, 1902 on the left, a man whose nickname was the Ancestor, to much more modern patrons, like the woman and her children at the right. This is Mrs. Carl Meyer and her children from 1896, the collection of the Tate. Mrs. Meyer was the wife of a wealthy Jewish banker in London. And Sargent uses equal flair and equal talent to portray both of these individuals. He had so many commissions that he could barely keep up with demand. This is a cartoon by his friend Max Beerbohm from about 1907, showing Sargent rushing in to paint the latest Duchess while musicians play in the foreground. And he could barely keep up with the demand. Rodin, at this point, dubs him the Van Dyck of our time. And he got fancier and fancier commissions. Winifred, the Duchess of Portland, on your left, wearing a very sort of Elizabethan collar, as you can see, that stand-up lace collar. Or on the right, Sir Frank Swettenham, the resident general of the British colonies in Malaysia. And I think you can see all the trappings of his office lined up to his left. These were done in 1902, 1903. They're very much official portraits. They tell you a lot about the position of these individuals in society. And they got grander and grander. This is Sargent's portrait on the left of the Marlborough family from 1905, which still hangs in Blenheim Palace, which you see at upper right, and you can see the portrait hanging in a room with all the old master paintings at lower right. This is Charles, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, with his American wife, Consuelo Vanderbilt, and their 2 sons, the heir and the spare. It's a story straight out of Edith Wharton. Consuelo was married for social position. Charles, the Duke, married her for her money. They were not happy together, and eventually they divorce, unusually. And I think you can see easily the role that these portraits played in establishing the heritage of the people who are in them. It's a very undisguised proclamation of dynasty. Look at the way the heir, John, the Marquess of Blandford, is holding the sword of his father. He is accepting that transfer of authority that had gone on for generations. Well, these paintings are interesting art historically, and they're often done with passages of very great beauty, but they didn't give Sargent a lot of artistic freedom. They were just much too tightly controlled, and he began to hate them. Here's another Beerbohm cartoon of a lineup of duchesses and their footmen outside Sargent's studio. Can you see him looking out the window in horror, just next to the round window? And with commissions like these lined up outside, you can just understand why Sargent began to hate painting portraits and why he gave them up almost entirely by 1907. He also didn't so much need the money that portrait commissions had been providing him. He had something else going on, and that brings us back to Massachusetts. Of course, all roads lead back to the hub, right? He did still make some portraits early in the 20th century. Here's this beautiful portrait of Mrs. Fisk Warren in the MFA's collection, which I just wanted to show you the photograph on the left because it shows Sargent painting it in the Gothic room at Fenway Court. But his main occupation at this point is the Boston Public Library murals. He'd been commissioned to decorate at the Boston Public Library in 1890, and that commission gave him a reliable source of income. So he was secure in his reputation, he was secure in his finances, He was excited by this new kind of painting that he'd been asked to do, and so he began to reshape his professional routine to suit his new interests more completely. And he traveled a lot, went everywhere, first to study decorative cycles at other places, a Tiepolo ceiling at upper left, an escutcheon, a sculpted escutcheon in Spain at lower left, a Byzantine mosaic at upper right, and at lower right, the very floor of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. He went to lots of places, often working in watercolor, much more portable and easy to make quick, informal sketches. And when he took a break from his studying for the murals, he took what we might call a working vacation, often in the Alps, often in the Simplon Pass. That was one of his favorite destinations on the border between Italy and Switzerland, where he made beautiful paintings like these, watercolors, this one in the MFA's collection of an avalanche track. He often turned his attention to landscape. And this one is more panoramic than some, but you can see how his interest is really in the piled up rocks, which are much more important in the composition than the distant peaks beyond. And that way of cropping and making near and far conflate are very characteristic of Sargent's later work. He often still painted figures, and you can see, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 people lying down in this watercolor called At the Top. He traveled with friends and family. They're indistinguishable sometimes in his work, although I can tell you that Emily wore a black cloak, his sister Emily, so she's the one who looks like a bean on the right-hand side of the composition. They even called each other the Intertwingles because he just painted them all whichever one happened to be there. And you see how informal the occasion was, where after they all hiked, they all just decided to take a nap at the top. But Sargent doesn't take a nap, he's painting, and his interest in these compositions is really the folds of the skirts, which become sort of a miniature landscape in and of themselves. These are sometimes carefully choreographed. Here's Sargent all set up, looking, as one critic put it, like a hatched chick with his painting umbrella around him. But sometimes he staged them very carefully. As you can see, Sargent in the white hat at the center, his sister Emily in the black looking over his shoulder, and his models very carefully set up before him. We know what he's painting. We can see it in the photograph. And this is what he made. It's called Reading. It's in the MFA's collection. It's his niece, Rosemary, lying and looking at us. And sitting under the green umbrella is Dorothy Barnard. You might not recognize her, but she was one of the little girls in Carnation Lily, Lily Rose. So you can see how long these friendships last. Again, his interest is really in that white skirt more than anything. His exploration of landscape continued for several years, but in 1914, he made this beautiful one called Master and His Pupils in the Austrian Tyrol. You can see again this sort of tipped-up composition, the lack of attention really to the figures, much more interest in the rocks and the tangle of branches. Sargent was in the Tyrol in 1914 when World War I broke out. And he was trapped there for weeks. It took a long time to get back to London. And soon he decided that war-torn Europe was not the place to be. And all roads lead to Massachusetts, where in 1916 he was given a second mural commission to decorate the rotunda of the Museum of Fine Arts. He was still working on the BPL commission. The BPL, in fact, was never finished. There's one place where the last painting never went. While he was in the US, he traveled around. He went to the Rockies, both in Montana and up into Canada. This is his Yoho Falls from 1916 on the left, from the Gardner Museum. He painted it in the same way he'd painted alpine scenery, and I'm just showing you one of his alpine landscapes at lower right so that you can see that same interest in the foreground, that same cropped composition, very different from a sort of panoramic view of the West that had been so traditional here. He also went to Florida. I just can't do a lecture without showing muddy alligators because I think it's one of my favorite things. 1917 in the collection of the Worcester Art Museum. He went there to paint an exceptional portrait of John D. Rockefeller, but he spent a lot of time at Vizcaya and became fascinated with these muddy alligators. Got to be a brave man to stand there.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of them's ready to open his mouth. This idyll of travel and sunshine came to an abrupt end when Sargent learned of the death of his niece Rosemary in Paris. There she is in reading. The cast of her hand in bronze is upstairs, belongs to the Sargent House and is here in your galleries. And Rosemary was in Paris in 1918 and was at Saint-Gervais in Paris for Easter services, and the Germans bombed the church. That is two photographs of the bombed out church on the right-hand side. Rosemary perished in that, and Sargent was very upset by it, immediately returned to London and got himself appointed an official war artist, and was sent, along with his friend Henry Tonks, to the Western Front in July 1918, and his work takes on quite a different twist. The U.S. had entered the war in April 1917, and Sargent's original commission from the War Committee was that he portray the cooperation between British and American troops. And in these freely painted sketches, you can see him trying to do just that, marching soldiers from both armies. The one at lower left belongs to the MFA, it's a little oil. The one at the upper right belongs to the Sargent House, it's a watercolor. The drawing at lower right of American troops belongs to the MFA, and I love Henry Tonks's caricature of Sargent painting under a camouflage umbrella that you see at upper left. The result of this trip to the Western Front was this painting called Gassed from 1919. There was a casualty clearing station in a small farming village along the road from Arras, and there wounded soldiers were given emergency treatment before being evacuated. In August 1918, Sargent witnessed an influx of soldiers who had been blinded by mustard gas, and as Tonks later recalled, the dressing station was situated on the road, and it consisted of a number of huts and a few tents. Gassed cases kept coming in. They sat or lay down on the grass. There must have been several hundred. Sargent was very struck by the scene and immediately made a lot of notes. His notes turned into this monumental canvas called Gassed, one of his most moving and largest images. It was the result for the British War Memorials Committee, and it belongs now to London's Imperial War Museum. But it's in Philadelphia right now if you want to see it in an exhibition about World War I and American art. He refers, as he always did, to art of the past, images as if they had been drawn from a classical frieze, combined with traditional images of the blind leading the blind. But he also painted this field of men, prone, intermingled, in sort of an ironic echo of those alpine figures tumbled together. It's one of his most moving paintings. It's not, though, the end of Sargent's life or the end of my story. It's almost the end of my story, you'll be glad to know. But we're going to circle back here to the beginning again in Massachusetts. Sargent spent much of his time after the war, in the late teens and early 20s, here in Boston, now working on 3 mural commissions. the as yet incomplete BPL cycle, an expanded commission at the MFA, which now extended to the grand staircase, which you see here on the left in an extremely dizzying photograph. I would point out that the commission also involved moving those monumental columns, which Sargent specified so they wouldn't get in the way of his paintings. And on the right, 2 World War I memorial images for Widener Library at Harvard. It's at this point when Sargent comes to know another family member, Charles Sprague Sargent, who you see here on the left in Sargent's beautiful portrait drawing of him from 1919 in the collection of the Sargent House. And on the right, I'm showing you 3 photographs that were taken at the Loring estate. John Singer and Charles Sprague sitting together in that rustic bench in the center and at lower right, and Sargent himself at upper right. Charles Sprague Sargent was a great botanist, a horticulturalist, and the director of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. And what Charles Sprague Sargent did, aside from getting Sargent interested in his ancestry, was getting him interested in the Sargent House. Who wrote the biographical notes for the genealogy of Ypes Sargent of Gloucester and his descendants? None other than Charles Sprague Sargent, the botanist and head of Arnold Arboretum. So that's the book at left. You can see that it reproduces Ypes Sargent's book plate, which was designed for him by Paul Revere. I'm showing you the MFA's version of that book plate at the top. And our friend Ypes Sargent, son of Ypes, father of Ypes. I love that. Again, at the bottom, along with the Sargent House at right. So the Sargent House at that point was functioning as sort of a family museum, and it was Charles Sprague Sargent who got Sargent interested in his whole genealogy and in the family story, which resulted in Sargent's connection to this place and this museum, which he proudly supported with gifts of art and also with funds. The 3 bronze pieces are upstairs for you to see here at Cape Ann during the winter and at the Sargent House when it reopens again later on in the season. It also, at this point in the early 1920s, had a whole room devoted to one of its most famous members, John Singer Sargent, a whole room of reproductions of Sargent's paintings. Well, Sargent now declared himself officially. This is a customs form that he filled out in 1924, declaring that his temporary residence was London, but his permanent residence was Boston. And we see it again and again. In the 1920s, a time of great patriotic fervor, when Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Henry Ford were collecting American folk art, when the Metropolitan Museum built a separate wing for its American collections, which opened in 1924, when the MFA was acquiring multiple works by John Singleton Copley, Gilbert Stuart, and John Singer Sargent himself, Sargent's American associations were heralded in the press, as you can see in these clippings. Frederick Coburn declaring in the New York Times, which you see in the background, that Sargent was, and I quote, "born in Italy, educated in art in France, an Englishman in accents, habits, and habiliments, but he has become in these later years a Bostonian, scion of Cape Ann stock. Mr. Sargent has discovered his New England cousins, and he likes them." In April of 1925, Sargent died in his sleep in London on the eve of another departure for Boston. It was front page news in the Boston Evening Globe, which you can see here on the right, which also declared in a follow-up article inside the paper, "Boston claims Sargent, great master, as her own." Tonight we've followed Sargent really from place to place, following this peripatetic artist as he moved, consciously really reinventing himself as the occasion demanded, as a master of stylish French portraiture, as an artist who brought European flair and sophistication to Boston, as the practitioner of British painting in the tradition of Reynolds and Van Dyck, as a keen observer of a distinctly modern kind of landscape painting, as a creator of monumental public art in the library, the MFA, and Widener, and finally as a proud descendant of a distinctly New England heritage. Sometimes people wonder how best to characterize a man who did all those different things. And they often ask if indeed we can consider Sargent an American painter at all. But I'd suggest that tonight, anyway, we'll all agree with Sargent's friend Henry James, who concluded as early as 1887 that, and I quote, "We'd be well advised to claim him." Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I will be happy to answer a few questions if anybody has any. I won't be offended if you don't want to stay for that part. Yes, here in the front.
I'm very interested in that portrait of the Voigt family. It's haunting. It's a haunting painting. There must have been some emotions involved there because they come forth so clear. Those two girls in the background.
Yeah.
Lovely little one. There's something very mysterious about that painting.
Well, the question.
History?
Well, funny you should ask. That painting is one of my favorite Sargents. The question was about the daughters of Edward Jarley Voigt and what sort of mysterious qualities that it has and what's sort of going on in it. I personally am totally taken with that painting, and I was so taken that I decided to write a book about it. So I'm going to say something that I hate it when other people say, which is, you can read it in my book. But there's a lot going on in it, both in terms of it as a fine art object, but also in terms of the family dynamic. And it was a great, great joy to try and figure it out. People see it in very different ways, and I think that is what makes it a masterpiece.
I'll read your book.
There you go. She'll read my book. I think you can buy it. Somebody, yeah.
What was his motivation for going to the point of declaring himself as American, since he was a citizen?
Okay, the question was, why did he bother to declare himself as an American at that point, since he was a citizen already? A lot of things artists who work abroad do is to avoid paying tariff. And an American artist, you know, proving that you're an American bringing work in is different than if you were a foreign artist importing work into the United States. So I don't know if that's true in Sargent's case, but it's true in the case of many other artists, including Whistler, for example, who did his best to lie and say that he was not from Massachusetts, that he, you know, was from Russia or South America or someplace that was way more exotic than Lowell. And the only time Whistler ever talks about being American practically is when he's trying to avoid jury duty and when he doesn't want to pay tariff. So that's my suspicion.
You're right, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What are the principal things that you've learned so far in working with the archival material that's come into the MFA?
The question is about the archival material that's come into the MFA and what I've learned so far from it. I'm dying to learn more. We received the material last year. It hasn't been properly processed yet in archival terms. It's in boxes. I don't know whether you could read Sargent's handwriting in the few letters that I showed you. It's very, very difficult. So it's going to take hours to really figure out what we've got. So far, what I'm finding out is that, as I suspected, Sargent was a man with a great sense of humor, a lot of really personal connections to the people that he wrote to, somewhat of a punster, so that his language is very clever, and someone who seems to have been often in a hurry. The letters are scrawled. They often, after you spend 2 hours trying to read it, it says, "I'm sorry, I can't meet you for lunch." I think because the letters have been held privately and a lot of excerpts of them have been published, but I think new eyes reading them, we're going to find a lot of new things. I've had the pleasure of going through the photographs. There are about 200 of them. And just seeing Sargent at different stages of his life and how he chose to present himself, a man who was very uncomfortable in public, whether he poses or doesn't pose is interesting, whether he decides to make a face because he really doesn't want to, make a dignified portrait. We found an old photograph album of official British World War I photographs. Not photographs Sargent took at the front, but official war photographs that were made, and I'm dying to go through that album and see what is in it and how it may or may not relate to Gast. So I would say that the work remains to be done, but it's like being a kid in a candy store. And if anybody wants to fund an archivist. Yes?
Are there any plans to publish more of the letters?
I would love to publish more of the letters. They need to be read. The question is there a plan to publish? In future, yes. I don't know whether a book is really in order or whether it makes sense to scan them and put them online. Which would make them much more accessible to scholars around the world. So that's my sort of fantasy. Although I think there's some wonderful letters, for example, to his sister that have little sketches in them and stuff that might be fun to make a book out of. You can't read them is the problem, so you would need to supply a translation. Yeah.
Who are his contemporaries as painters that he most admired?
Question is, who as painters did Sargent most admired? One of the painters he most admired, even though he painted completely differently than Sargent, was Monet. And we have Sargent's, in the archive, we have Sargent's letters to Monet, and they are fan letters. I went to Paris, I saw your latest painting, I can't believe how beautiful it was. Monet comes to London several times, and Sargent writes, "When's your train? I'll meet you at the station. We're going for dinner. I'm going to introduce you to Whistler." They're very enthusiastic. So Monet is definitely one. Degas is one. He likes very avant-garde things, although he himself never goes as far into modernism as the Impressionist artists do. Anybody else? I'm off the hook. Thank you for coming.